Hey everyone, this is Theo from Headphones.com, and today I will be sharing my thoughts on the Elysian Annihilator. If you're not familiar with Elysian, short for Elysian Acoustic Labs, they are a one-man show based out of Malaysia, and this is their flagship IEM that clocks in at $3,700 USD. Yeah, not a cheap IEM, and before someone calls me out for my clickbait review title, I do want to note that at the time of this review, I am pretty much the only person in the US who has had the opportunity to hear this IEM. Well, technically I also brought it over for super review to hear, but I think you get my point. This IEM is obscure. That being said, I do want to give my thanks to a very generous reader who sent this in for review. I don't think I would have been able to hear it otherwise. As usual though, what follows are my honest thoughts and opinions to the best of my ability. Let's take a look. Okay, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to comment very much on the presentation and the accessories because all I received were the IEMs themselves in a Pelican 1010 case. That being said, if we take a look at the Annihilator, you can see that it sports a clear resin for the shell and then it has a gold faceplate on top with the brand's logo emblazoned on it. I really like these type of logo designs where you can sort of see the shadow floating, and if you take a closer look inside the shell itself, you can see the Foster dynamic driver being used for the bass, the 4 balanced armatures for the mid-range, and then the 2 electrostatics for the high. Very well built IEM overall, although I will note that the shell itself is on the larger side to accommodate all the unique technologies which have been packed inside. Something else to take note of is the connector points. Unlike a lot of IEMs which use 2-pin connectors or MMCX connectors, the Annihilator utilizes Pentacon connectors. Pretty sweet overall, and I actually think this is more reliable than the MMCX connectors, which will wear down and break over enough time. Just be aware that if you're planning to pick up an upgrade cable for this IEM, that the Pentacon connectors are not very common. Let's talk about the overall tonality of the Annihilator. It follows what I would most closely classify as a bright V-shaped tuning. It is a more forward presentation in general that sort of walks that line without ever quite getting too fatiguing for my taste. That being said, I will note again that this is quite the bright IEM, so I think some listeners will be predisposed to not really gel with this tonality from the outset. That out of the way though, it is objectively a well-tuned IEM, at least in the most objective sense possible. Starting from the bass, this is probably honestly the most unremarkable part of the Annihilator to my ears. It is tokened by a Foster dynamic driver, and it is mid-bass emphasized, so it is going for that sense of punch to it. That being said, it really just sounds a little bit dry to my ears in terms of quality. There is a sort of compression to it, like it doesn't really scale macro dynamics very well. I'm really not sure what else to say. I don't think it's a very good driver in general, and the sort of icing on the cake is the constant driver flex. If you're not familiar with what driver flex is, it is a sort of metallic crinkling of the driver when you insert the IEMs into your ear. With the Annihilator, it's not just when you insert it into your ear, but it's also when you're moving around, so it's constantly flexing. And personally, that sort of marred the bass response for me. I will say that it is a adequate bass response, but when we're talking a like $3,600 IEM, I kind of expect the best, which this simply is not. However, moving into the mid-range, it's pretty much all uphill from here, and kind of literally actually in terms of tonality. So you have your flat lower mid-range, and then you have a rise to the peanut compensation and the upper mid-range, and this rise is quite aggressive. This sort of tuning philosophy is not uncommon with a lot of chi-fi IEMs, but the sheer resolution and the sheer clarity of the Annihilator's mid-range cannot be understated. This is probably one of the cleanest mid-ranges that I've heard amongst IEMs. I will note that it has a sort of digital edge to it, and this is in the sense that it sounds a little bit artificial at times, maybe not quite tonally correct, but if you're asking me, that is a small price to pay for just how darn resolving this mid-range is. Moving into the treble though. The treble is where the Annihilator really makes its mark. Now you guys might not know this, but I am actually not a big fan of the Sonyan electrostatic drivers. Every implementation that I have heard, I can only describe them as sounding quite soft, blunted, and lacking in microdynamics, which is ironically pretty much the opposite, the complete opposite of what a true electrostatic should sound like. That being said, the Annihilator is an exception. It is the only IEM that I have heard to date with what I would consider to be a true implementation of the Sonyan eStat drivers. For starters, it is just so fast. In terms of transient attack, it is easily the quickest IEM that I've heard. The only other exception to that really would be the Shure KSE 1500, which is of course a true electrostatic. But yeah, fast, fast, fast. Even on like the most treble intensive tracks that I threw against the Annihilator, it just caught every single little sparkle, percussive hit, all that stuff, man. It captures it all. It's so quick. Something pretty interesting to note is that if you look at the frequency response of the Annihilator, it has a small dip at around 6K hertz in the lower treble. And what this basically does is it lends the perception of like treble sounds just sort of flitting out of thin air. It's really interesting to see this and hear it in practice, and I think it lends to that sense of immediacy to treble instruments in the way they are articulated. Outside of this, the other selling point of the Annihilator would of course be its shear extension and tuning. After that dip at 6K hertz, the Annihilator has like linear treble. Like it just goes straight up to 20K hertz, or pretty much the upper limits of my hearing. I don't think I can even hear 20K hertz anymore. My hearing tops out at around 19K hertz. But yeah, it just goes straight up, man. It is completely linear, and the benefit of this is that even though there is a ton of air quantity, because it is so smooth, it doesn't really come off as fatiguing to my ears. I imagine that if you're really sensitive to the air frequencies, it will maybe come off a little bit too bright, a little bit too airy. For me personally though, this was not an issue, and just in general, I think I would say that the Annihilator sets a benchmark for treble. In terms of speed, extension, and sheer linearity of the response itself, there really is nothing on par with the Annihilator. You have stuff like the Sony IR-Z1R. The Annihilator is not going to match that sense of, I guess, hardness to the transients and that really incredible reverb that the Z1R has. But as a whole, I would say that the Annihilator is easily on par. For technicalities, the Annihilator is once again a class-leading IM. I was actually A-Bing it with my 64 Audio U12T, which is pretty much the IM that every IM that goes through my hands gets compared to, and it was easily on par for detail retrieval. It actually beat it out in terms of sheer resolution, particularly in the mid-range, where the U12T has a dip in the 3 to 4K hertz region. So yeah, you can name any of the big hitter IMs like the VX, the Odin, the Earl Konig, and I would pretty confidently say that the Annihilator is at least on par with these IMs for detail retrieval and sheer resolution. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the Annihilator's treble response in this. Of course, when you have a brighter IM, that's inherently going to boost the perception of resolution, but the speed of the Annihilator's treble response means that it's picking up every little minute treble detail. Something that also plays quite a bit into treble response is imaging. When an IM is able to reproduce treble air and reverb to a considerable extent, our perception of the stage and the way the sort of stage is shaped around us benefits. The Annihilator is a pretty good example of this. I would say that width specifically is where it shines most. It just sounds so open. And I was listening to, I think it was Sawano Hiroyuki's, I think it was Fave, that new track on his new album. And anyways, there's a series of drum hits at the back right left channels at around 12 seconds in, and they just sound so sonic wall free on the Annihilator. It almost reminds me of the Sony IR-Z1R. And speaking of which, I don't think that the Annihilator is quite class leading in terms of soundstage height or soundstage width. The Z1R has a beat in soundstage height, and the U12T has a beat in terms of depth with its very speaker-like center image. Nonetheless, pretty much everything on the Annihilator stage has a well-defined compartment and a good sense of space and air in between each instrument. For other more latent intangibles like macrodynamics, the Annihilator is no slouch either, and this is something that a lot of other IMs sort of mess up on. Very uncompressed dynamics and a very visceral sense of macrodynamic punch in general. I think that's a pretty good tie-in point to coherency, which I would say is the biggest weakness of the Annihilator. Just in general, there is a lack of weight and sense of transient density to the way notes are articulated on the Annihilator. This definitely isn't helped by the fact that it is such a quick and speedy IM. Transients just fly by on it to the point of which it almost sounds a little bit raw, for lack of a better word. On one hand, I can see that this sort of befits its name, the Annihilator. That totally lines up, right? But at the same time, I can't help but feel that the Annihilator would benefit from a smoother presentation at times. I'm going to do a little flexing here and say that at this point, I have heard well over 100 IMs. Of those 100 IMs, there are roughly 5 IMs that I think are top tier, IMs that sort of stand at the audio summit. Then of those 5 IMs, there are less than 3 that I think are worthy of best in the world status. The Annihilator is part of that exclusive club. It is simply class leading in so many respects. From its technical performance, the technology inside, to its, of course, its EST treble, there's really nothing quite like it that I've heard in terms of IMs. Just as a rule of thumb, I personally cannot recommend multi-kilobuck IEMs just because I don't think the value proposition is there. But if you want to hear what one of the best IEMs in the world sounds like, well, you know where to look now. I can really say that the Annihilator is one of the few IEMs that I've heard in quite a while that has actually blown me away. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for my review. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next one.